I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the metallic scraping at my front door. At first, I thought it was the mailman with a package, but the sound was wrong, deliberate, persistent, like someone trying to force a key that didn't fit. I set down my mug and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see Margaret Hendricks, our HOA president, crouched at my door with what looked like a ring of keys. Her face twisted in concentration as she jammed one after another into my lock. When she spotted me watching, she didn't have the decency to look embarrassed. Instead, she straightened up, smoothed her blazer, and marched over to knock on my window with the authority of someone who believed she owned the place. "Mr. Castellano," she called through the glass, her voice carrying that particular pitch of entitlement I'd come to recognize. "Open this door immediately. I have a scheduled compliance inspection, and your refusal to cooperate is a violation of Section 12(7) of the HOA covenant." I opened the window instead of the door. "Margaret, you were trying to break into my house." "I was attempting to use my master key," she replied, holding up the ring like it was evidence of her authority. Every homeowner is required to provide a copy to the association for emergency access and compliance purposes. "Show me where that's written in the covenant," I said, knowing full well it wasn't. Her face flushed. "Mr. Castellano, I don't have time for your games. Either you open this door, or I'm calling the police for obstruction." I couldn't help but smile at that. "Go ahead, Margaret. Call them. Let me back up and explain how we got to this point. My name is Frank Castellano, and I'm a 58-year-old retired fire captain who moved to Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago after my wife passed. I wanted somewhere quiet, peaceful, and low maintenance, where I could tend a small garden and maybe restore the vintage Mustang I'd bought but never had time to work on. The house was perfecta, modest ranch on a corner lot, with enough space for a workshop and a garden that reminded me of the one my grandfather kept when I was a kid. Willowbrook Estates was one of those newer developments where every house looked like it was designed by the same committee-neutral colors, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that promised to maintain property values and community standards. When I bought the place, the HOA seemed reasonable enough. Monthly dues of $85, basic landscaping for common areas, and a covenant that mostly dealt with obvious things like no broken-down cars in driveways and keeping your grass cut. What I didn't realize was that Margaret Hendricks, who lived in the largest house at the end of Maple Street, treated the HOA presidency like a personal kingdom. She was one of those women who thrived on small-scale power, the type who'd probably been student body president in high school and never gotten over the rush of telling people what to do. In her mid-50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a permanent bun and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of business blazers, Margaret approached homeownership like a military operation. The trouble started 6 months after I moved in, when I planted tomatoes and peppers in my backyard. Not some sprawling farm, just 4 raised beds in an area that couldn't be seen from the street. I came home from the hardware store one Saturday to find a citation stuck to my door. Violation notice. Unauthorized vegetable garden in violation of landscape standards outlined in Section 8. 4C. I read Section 8. 4C. It prohibited commercial agricultural activities and unsightly storage of farming equipment. My raised beds didn't qualify as either, but when I called Margaret to discuss it, she informed me that any food-producing plants were considered agricultural and therefore prohibited. When I pointed out that several neighbors had fruit trees, she said those were grandfathered in from before the current interpretation of the rules. "Current interpretation?" I asked. "The board has clarified the language to reflect community standards," she replied with the tone of someone reading from a script. That's when I realized I was dealing with someone who made up rules as she went along. But I'm a patient man, and I figured I could work within the system. I requested a formal hearing, submitted photographs of my garden alongside the actual text of the covenant, and presented my case to the 5-person HOA board. Margaret sat at the head of the table like a judge, flanked by 4 neighbors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The hearing lasted exactly 12 minutes. Margaret dismissed my evidence, claimed that community standards evolve, and upheld the violation with a $150 fine. When I asked for a copy of these evolving standards, she said they were being formalized and would be distributed in due course. I paid the fine and moved my vegetables to containers on my patio, where they thrived. Margaret drove by twice a week to make sure they were still there. And I started to understand that this wasn't really about gardens or community standards. This was about establishing who was in charge. The harassment escalated from there. Over the next year, I received citations for parking my truck in my own driveway, it was allegedly too large, despite fitting entirely within the paved area, installing a motion sensor light over my garage, unauthorized electrical modifications, and painting my front door a shade of blue that was incompatible with community aesthetics. Even though it was identical to the blue on 3 other houses in the neighborhood, each citation came with a fine, each appeal was denied, and each interaction with Margaret became more surreal. She'd park across the street from my house, taking photographs with a zoom lens. She'd knock on my door at 7 a.m. to inform me that my newspaper was lying too far from my porch. She once cited me for excessive noise pollution because I was using a hammer in my garage on a Saturday afternoon. The final straw came when she somehow convinced the Postal Service to install a cluster mailbox at the end of the street, claiming individual mailboxes were outdated and inefficient. Every homeowner had to walk 3 blocks to collect their mail. But Margaret insisted this was progress. When I pointed out that she'd had her own mailbox moved to the side of her house closer than anyone else's had ever been, she said board members were exempt from certain restrictions due to their administrative responsibilities. That's when I started documenting everything. Every citation, every fine, every interaction, every photograph she took of my property. I researched property law, HOA regulations, and what I discovered was that Margaret had been operating far outside the authority granted by our covenant. She couldn't legally access anyone's property without permission, couldn't impose fines beyond what was outlined in the original agreement, and certainly couldn't make up new rules without a formal amendment process that required homeowner approval. But knowing she was wrong and proving it were 2 different things, Margaret had created a system where she was judge, jury, and enforcement, and the other board members either supported her or were too intimidated to speak up. I needed leverage, and I was about to get more than I ever expected. The breakthrough came when Margaret overplayed her hand. After 18 months of escalating harassment, she sent me a certified letter demanding access to my home for a comprehensive compliance inspection. The letter claimed that multiple violations had been reported by neighbors, and that Section 15, 2 of the covenant granted the HOA authority to enter any property to document non-compliance issues. I read Section 15. R. It dealt with emergency situations where immediate access was necessary to prevent property damage, things like burst pipes or fires. There was nothing about routine inspections, and certainly nothing about forced entry. But Margaret had apparently decided that the rules didn't apply to her anymore. The letter gave me 48 hours to schedule the inspection or face escalated enforcement actions. When I didn't respond, she showed up at my door with her ring of keys, apparently believing she had some kind of master access to every home in the neighborhood. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that my son Michael is a sheriff's deputy for the county, not just any deputy, but a 15-year veteran who'd worked his way up to sergeant and specialized in property crimes and domestic disputes. He'd grown up hearing stories about my job as a fire captain, about the importance of following protocols and respecting people's rights, and he'd carried those lessons into his own career. Michael had been quietly furious about Margaret's harassment for months. As a law enforcement officer, he understood exactly how far outside legal boundaries she'd strayed, but he'd held back out of respect for my desire to handle things through proper channels. The attempted break-in changed everything. When Margaret started fumbling with her keys at my door that morning, I'd already texted Michael a simple message: "She's here with keys, trying to get in." By the time she was threatening to call the police, he was already in his patrol car, 3 minutes away from my house, and armed with months of documentation I'd been sharing with him about Margaret's illegal activities. "Go ahead, Margaret. Call them," I repeated, and she did exactly that. I watched through my window as she stood on my front lawn, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the breathless, urgent tone of someone reporting a genuine emergency. Yes, I need officers at 847 Maple Street immediately. A homeowner is refusing to comply with a lawful HOA inspection and has barricaded himself inside his residence. Barricaded. Like I was some kind of domestic terrorist, instead of a man standing in his own living room. Yes, I'm the HOA president, and we have legal authority to inspect properties for covenant violations, she continued, pacing back and forth across my lawn like she was preparing for battle. The homeowner is being belligerent and uncooperative. I've attempted to use my master key, but he's apparently changed his locks without authorization. Master key. Changed locks without authorization. Each phrase was a fresh revelation of how completely Margaret had lost touch with reality. I almost felt sorry for the dispatcher who had to make sense of her complaint. What happened next was the kind of poetic justice that you'd think was too perfect to be real. But sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Margaret had just finished giving her statement to dispatch when a sheriff's patrol car turned onto Maple Street. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the car with the confident stride of someone who believed the cavalry was arriving to support her. The car door opened, and out stepped Michael in full uniform 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of dealing with actual criminals instead of imaginary HOA violations. Margaret started talking before he was halfway across the lawn. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly. I'm Margaret Hendricks, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She extended her hand like she was greeting a visiting dignitary. "I've been trying to conduct a routine compliance inspection, but Mr. Castellano has locked himself inside and is refusing to cooperate with association regulations." Michael didn't shake her hand. Instead, he pulled out his notepad and pen, the gesture every cop makes when they're about to document something official. "Ma'am, I need to understand exactly what's happening here. You called to report what kind of incident?" "A homeowner refusing to comply with HOA authority," Margaret repeated, apparently not noticing that Michael's tone was more interrogative than supportive. "We have established protocols for property inspections, and Mr. Castellano is violating multiple sections of our covenant by denying access. And what authority do you have to enter Mr. Castellano's home?" Margaret blinked, as if the question didn't make sense. "I'm the HOA president. We have oversight responsibility for all properties in the development." "I understand that, ma'am, but I'm asking about your specific legal authority to enter someone's private residence without their permission." That's when I saw the first crack in Margaret's confidence. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. It's in the covenant. Section 15. 2 grants access for compliance inspections. Michael made a note. "Have you read Section 15? 2 recently." "Ma'am? Of course I have. I wrote the enforcement guidelines myself. Could you show me where it grants authority for routine inspections?" Margaret's face was starting to flush. "Officer, I don't appreciate being questioned like I'm some kind of criminal. I called for assistance with an uncooperative homeowner, not to be interrogated about HOA procedures." That's when Michael looked directly at my window and gave the slightest notice signal I'd seen him use since he was a kid, when he was about to spring a surprise. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with Mr. Castellano to get his side of the story. Would you mind waiting here while I knock on his door?" "He won't answer," Margaret said quickly. "He's been hostile and uncooperative throughout this entire process." Michael walked up to my front door and knocked in the measured, official pattern that cops use: 3 sharp raps. Pause. 2 more. "Mr. Castellano? This is Sergeant Castellano with the Sheriff's Department. Could I speak with you for a moment?" I opened the door, and the look on Margaret's face when she heard the name was worth every citation she'd ever written. "Hello, Sergeant," I said formally, playing along with the theater of it all. "Sir, we received a report about some kind of dispute regarding a property inspection. Could you tell me what's been happening here?" I gave him the basic facts. Margaret's attempted forced entry, her claim about master keys, her demand for interior access, while she stood 20 feet away. Clearly straining to hear every word, Michael took notes, asked clarifying questions, and maintained the professional demeanor of a cop investigating a legitimate complaint. "And do you have any documentation of these previous interactions with Miss Hendricks?" "I do." I handed him the folder I'd been keeping copies of every citation, every fine, every threatening letter, along with photographs of Margaret taking pictures of my property from the street. Michael flipped through it slowly, his expression never changing. But I could see him cataloging every violation of property rights and privacy laws. "Mr. Castellano, would you be willing to file a formal complaint about this matter? I think that would be appropriate." "Yes." Michael nodded and walked back to Margaret, who had spent the last 10 minutes watching her confident morning dissolve into something she clearly hadn't expected. "Ma'am, I've spoken with Mr. Castellano, and I need to clarify a few things about this situation." "Officer, whatever he's told you." "Ma'am, please let me finish." Michael's voice carried the kind of authority that makes people stop talking immediately. "First, attempting to use keys to enter someone's home without their permission constitutes attempted unlawful entry, which is a misdemeanor under state law. Second, claiming to have master key authority over private residences is false impersonation of authority. Third, demanding access to someone's home under threat of fines or penalties constitutes harassment and possibly extortion. Margaret stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "But I'm the O president." "Yes, ma'am. And HOA presidents are subject to the same laws as everyone else. You cannot enter private property without permission. You cannot demand access to people's homes. And you cannot impose unauthorized fines or penalties." "This is ridiculous." Margaret sputtered. "I've been managing this community for 4 years. I know what my authority is." "Ma'am, what you've been doing is committing multiple violations of property rights and privacy laws. Mr. Castellano has documented evidence of harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent citations, going back over a year." That's when Margaret made the mistake that turned this from a property dispute into a criminal matter. Instead of backing down or asking for clarification, she doubled down on her delusion. "I don't care what your name is or what uniform you're wearing," she snapped, her voice rising to the pitch of someone who'd completely lost control. "This is my community, and I have authority here that supersedes whatever jurisdiction you think you have. These homeowners signed a covenant, and that means I have rights." Michael stopped writing and looked up from his notepad. In all the years I'd known him, through academy graduation, promotions, and countless family dinners, where he'd shared stories about difficult calls, I'd never seen that particular expression on his face. It was the look of a professional who'd just been told they don't have authority in their own jurisdiction. "Ma'am, are you telling a sworn law enforcement officer that HOA regulations supersede state and federal law?" Margaret lifted her chin like she was making some kind of noble declaration. "I'm telling you that property covenants create binding legal obligations, and homeowners cannot simply ignore them because they're inconvenient. And I'm telling you that you've just confessed to multiple crimes while interfering with a police investigation." The change in Michael's tone was subtle but unmistakable. He'd shifted from investigating a complaint to arresting a suspect, and Margaret was too wrapped up in her own righteousness to notice. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted unlawful entry, harassment, and interference with a police officer." Michael reached for his handcuffs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "You have the right to remain silent?" Margaret's mouth fell open as the Miranda rights continued, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally rage as the handcuffs clicked shut. "This is insane. You can't arrest me for doing my job." "Ma'am, attempting to break into someone's house is not part of any legitimate job description." The neighbors started coming out as Michael loaded Margaret into the back of his patrol car. 4 years of her rule had left most of them either intimidated or completely fed up, and watching her get arrested on my front lawn apparently brought out emotions they'd been keeping hidden. "Mrs. Patterson from across the street actually started clapping. "Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been fined 3 times for parking his work van in his own driveway, stood on his porch, grinning like Christmas had come early. "Is she really getting arrested?" called out Sarah Chen, the young mother from 2 houses down, who'd been cited for leaving her children's toys in her backyard. "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied professionally, "for attempted unlawful entry and harassment." The patrol car pulled away with Margaret in the back seat, still protesting her innocence through the window. And the street fell quiet, except for the sound of neighbors talking in small groups, sharing stories about citations and fines and late-night photography sessions they'd all endured but never discussed. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Margaret's arrest made the local news, not because HOA disputes are usually newsworthy, but because someone getting arrested for trying to break into houses with fake master keys is the kind of absurd story that captures public attention. The headline read, "OA President Arrested for Attempted Break-In at Member's Home." And the article included details about her claims of authority that made her sound like she'd declared herself queen of a suburban kingdom. The story went viral on social media, shared by homeowners across the country who dealt with their own version of Margaret. The comments section became a support group for people with HOA horror stories, and Margaret became the face of everything wrong with unaccountable neighborhood power structures. But the real consequences were legal and financial. The district attorney's office, after reviewing Michael's report and the documentation I'd provided, filed formal charges for attempted unlawful entry, harassment, and fraudulent collection of fines. It turned out that Margaret had been imposing penalties that weren't authorized by our covenant and keeping the money in a separate account she controlled, essentially stealing from the homeowners she claimed to represent. The state also opened an investigation into the HOA's finances, discovering that Margaret had spent association funds on personal expenses, including the professional-grade camera she'd used to spy on residents and the certified mail she'd sent for her fake violations. The total came to nearly $8,000 in misappropriated funds over 2 years. The civil lawsuit came next. Once the criminal charges were filed, 3 other homeowners joined me in a class action suit against both Margaret personally and the HOA for violations of property rights, harassment, and fraudulent collection of fees. Our lawyer, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in property law, took one look at the documentation and called it the most clear-cut case of HOA abuse she'd ever seen. The settlement was substantial. Margaret was ordered to pay $25, nil in damages, cover all legal fees, and resign from the HOA board permanently. The association itself was placed under court supervision for 2 years to ensure proper governance and financial oversight. Every fine she'd imposed was refunded, and the covenant was amended to include strict limits on board authority and mandatory approval processes for any rule changes. Margaret's house went up for sale 6 weeks after her arrest. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd taken a job in another state, probably hoping to start over somewhere. Her new neighbors wouldn't know about her criminal record. The last I saw of her was a moving truck pulling away on a Tuesday morning, loaded with the furniture and belongings from the house she tried to turn into an HOA command center. The new HOA president is David Kim, a retired accountant who ran on a platform of transparency and limited authority. His first act was to publish all board meetings online and create a formal appeals process for any violations. His second was to remove the cluster mailbox and restore individual delivery to every house. His third was to organize a neighborhood barbecue where people could actually talk to each other instead of communicating through citation notices. My garden is thriving now, not just the containers on my patio, but the raised beds I rebuilt in my backyard, along with a small greenhouse Michael helped me construct last fall. Mrs. Patterson started her own vegetable garden after seeing mine, and we trade tomatoes for peppers every summer. Mr. Rodriguez parks his work van wherever he wants, and Sarah Chen's kids leave toys scattered across their backyard, like children should. The neighborhood feels different, no relaxed, friendly, like a place where people actually want to live, instead of a place where they're afraid of making mistakes. We still have standards and rules, but they're reasonable ones that serve the community instead of feeding someone's power fantasies. Margaret taught us all a valuable lesson, though probably not the one she intended. She showed us that authority without accountability becomes tyranny. Even on the small scale of a suburban subdivision, she proved that bullies can't function when people stand up to them collectively. And she demonstrated that sometimes the best way to deal with someone who makes up rules is to remind them about the real ones. I still live at 847 Maple Street. In the house Margaret tried so hard to control. The door she couldn't open is still painted the same shade of blue. She hated so much. The motion sensor light she cited me for still illuminates my garage every evening. And every morning when I check my mail delivered right to my front door, where it belongs. I remember that sometimes justice comes with handcuffs, and sometimes it just comes with the quiet satisfaction of being left alone to live your life in peace.